So, brace yourselves for a whiz through the man that is Jodorowsky. He's had probably more job descriptions than everybody in this entire room put together. He's a film director, producer, actor, philosopher, guru, therapist, tarot expert, novelist, playwright, poet, mime, artist, musician, adjunct provocateur, co-founder of an art movement, and a comics writer. So he's done a hell of a lot. I'm not going to be able to obviously cover all of that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about why I think he's probably one of the most important sort of creators in about the last 50 years. He was born on the 7th of February in 1929 in Topo in Chile, and he was from, the reason he's got that name Jodorowsky is he was from Jewish and Polish and Ukrainian immigrant family that moved over there after the pogroms, and he was brought up, he had a very unhappy childhood. He was not particularly loved by his parents, he particularly didn't like his dad, and we'll kind of come to that a little bit later on. So out of this unhappy childhood, he really sort of went into himself, and he was somebody, I think he was just kind of destined to be an incredibly creative kind of guy. He learned puppetry and mime as a very young guy. He started doing his own writing, and even in his early teens, he set up his own theatre troupe, which was Teatro Mimico in 1947. So by the late teens, when he was in his late teens, he joined a pantomime troupe in the 1950s, and this kind of obviously played a very important part of his life and growing up. And so you see all the way through in a lot of his films, you've got circus imagery. This is from Santa Sangre, and you know, with the other works in his graphic novels, The Son of a Gun, there's all these kind of weird freak show characters and quirky sort of performance people, and that circus atmosphere is very, you know, prevalent throughout his work. But within a couple of years, having done the mime, he then sort of moved over to Paris, and he started working with some really interesting people over there. One of them was Maurice Chevalier, and the other one was probably the king of mime, Marcel Marceau. And he got to know Marcel Marceau, and they joined his troupe, and actually started writing a lot of Marceau's sort of mime pieces, his set pieces, and became one of his key writers. And one of the pieces that he wrote was actually then turned into a graphic novel later on called Pietrolino, which was about a mime set in World War II in France. But it's a mime who has his hands disfigured, so he ends up being a mime with boxing gloves on. So he can't do all this kind of interesting stuff that Marcel Marceau would do. So he was always trying to challenge himself and do things in a slightly different way. So he started going touring around the world with Marceau, and they ended up in Mexico in 1960. And at that point, Jodorowsky kind of parted company with Marceau and decided to stay there. And he teamed up with a couple of surrealist artists, Fernando Arrabal and Roland Topor. And together, the three of them created this movement called the Panic Art Movement. And it was all about, well, he actually says the Panic Movement was a kind of a joke. Everything we did was panic. You know, it was more of a theory and more of a brand. But the idea was to basically challenge and upset and really kind of drive people a bit crazy. And they did everything from paintings and sort of prose stories, and they did these very challenging sort of art performance pieces where people were naked and they would kill animals on stage, and it's all very kind of like totally crazy. And round about this time, he did his first comic. He had actually done a newspaper strip. He was writing and drawing a newspaper strip for a local Mexican newspaper. But then he came up with this idea for a strip called Annabelle 5. And he got an artist, Manuel Moro, to draw it. And it was published by a publisher called Nova Moro in Mexico in 1966. And the whole idea is it was this scantily clad sort of cyborg super spy superhero character who had all these weapons out of his body and everything, and it was kind of like James Bond meets the Terminator by way of Flesh Gordon, because it's incredibly sort of sexist and sexy and just kind of really over the top. he recalled it as saying that it was an artistic concept, not an industrial one. I did it for free for Navarro. The publishing director was an admirer of my theatrical plays, so I convinced him to create a sci-fi serial. At a time when Mexico, no one was producing anything similar. We bet on the colour, so they went full colour, which was pretty unusual at the time as well. And comics back then, like around the rest of the world really, were looked on as very much kids' fare. He said, no, let's make this totally adult. This is going to be really for an adult readership. So that's that's one panel there from it, and that's the cover. Now the interesting thing about the cover was that the publishers decided to, because it was kind of a sexy story and everything, they went and put on this Latino movie heartthrob, Jorge Rivero, on the covers. And Jodorowsky was like incensed by this. He's going, no, this is what I'm actually taking the piss out of. My whole thing is to undermine, this stupidity of macho machismo and sort of stuff. And they missed the whole point. So he had a big argument with the publishers. And he said, no, I want Morrow to draw the covers. And it was a big hoo-ha and everything. They said, okay, eventually. It was supposed to be 12 issues. And finally got to issue 6. And the Morrow cover came on, and the publisher hadn't really looked at what was going on. But once he'd seen the interiors of the strip, he said, you can't do that, that's outrageous stuff, and they cancelled it. So it never finished in this series. So he was always about challenging and just basically winding people up. And that kind of was the first side of it. And he was never really short from controversy. When he did his first film, 2 years after Annabelle 5, Fando and Lis, it was incredibly shocking. He basically, it wasn't so much necessarily the content, but it was the mood and the vibe of it. It was very unsettling. And for Mexico, which was very conservative and Catholic at that time, it just freaked him out completely. And apparently on the premiere night of the screening, a riot broke out, and he had to sneak out the back door and smuggle into a car while there were big rocks thrown at him. And it got so bad that the film was actually banned in Mexico, so it was never really shown again. Obviously, this is a poster from the American release, so it did get shown over in America. But it's kind of, the classic idea of what Jodorowsky was doing. And I think this one really kind of, to me, sums up. This is a grandfather talking to his grandson, and I think this line says it all. Given that I'd be dead, I would ask them to make a beautiful drum with my skin. And I think that to me encapsulates a lot of what sort of Jodorowsky is about. It's that something that's kind of slightly sweet and interesting, but slightly creepy at the same time. So after Fando and Lis, he decided that he'd like to explore cinema a lot more. And he then went to make probably one of his best known films in 1970, which is El Topo. Now the story about that is interesting, as he was looking for the right actor to play the lead character of El Topo, who is this sort of Western gunslinger. And he couldn't find the right actor, so basically he just played him himself. So that is Jodorowsky as El Topo. And that's, I was going to say that's a weird film, but you could say that about all of his stuff. It's like, there's the classic thing of when people ask, well, what's the film about? And you just go, everything. It's just, he just covers absolutely everything in his films. So it's a very spiritual Western. And the interesting thing about this film is it became a bit of a cult classic in Manhattan in the 70s. And it became the first of the sort of midnight movies that was shown in the late night cinemas. And it became, as the cult film started growing up in the late night screenings. And John Lennon and Yoko Ono became such big fans of the film that they convinced the executive, Alan Klein at Apple Music, to put it on a bigger distribution across America. And they then even gave Jodorowsky $1 million to help finance his next film, which was Holy Mountain. Now that's Jodorowsky again. So, and to try and describe what Holy Mountain is about, it's an exploration of Western esoterica. It is full of sort of hidden, sort of magical symbolism and iconography, and it's just an incredible sort of, very acid trip type movie. He actually said that he was trying to make films that would have the same effect of taking acid without having to take the drug. And that's everything that he was trying to do. He's just trying to sort of blow people's minds, essentially. Then, thanks to those two films, he got this reputation as being a very brave and courageous and interesting director. And he moved to Paris by this stage, back again. And he'd been approached by a famous French producer who said to him, if you could make any film in the world, what would you like? And he went, Dune. That's the film I want to make. It's a Frank Herbert's novel that came out in 1965. And he thought this would make a fantastic epic story. So he gathered a group of incredible artists when you sort of realise who this team was. So he got together, that's Mobius in the baseball jacket. I don't know who the chap in the middle is, but that's based on one of Mobius's designs, and Jodorowsky there. And he took Mobius, H.R. Geiger, and Dan O'Bannon, and a whole load of really interesting kind of visionary creators and artists, and brought them all together to make this film. Chris Foss, the famous sort of sci-fi painter, did a lot of sort of science fiction paperback covers. You'll recognise his spaceships if you see him. And so he put all this together, and he just kind of went a bit mad with it, really. You see this massive great book here. He got this fantastic book which had all the design work. He'd storyboarded the whole thing. It'd been completely scripted. He got, as David Carradine was going to be in the film, I think he was going to get Mick Jagger in it. Basically everyone he ever met just said, do you want to be in this film? So he was going to have Orson Welles in it. The great Orson Welles story is he took him to Orson Welles' favourite restaurant, said, if you're in my film, I will make the chef here cook on the set for you every single day. And he was making these outlandish promises. He said to Salvador Dali, he said, will you be in my film as the mad god of the universe, or the mad emperor of the universe? And Dali said, yeah, only if you put like flaming giraffes in it. And he's like, yeah, sure, why not? Let's chuck that in there. It's like anything goes. And it was kind of, it was so ambitious that it was kind of destined to fail. And unfortunately, the Americans kind of, which they needed the American money, were going like, yeah, it's okay, we kind of like it, but not with that director. He's just too out there. He's just too much of a loose cannon. There's a fantastic documentary all about this, which is Jodorowsky's Dune, which I recommend. Has anyone seen it? Yeah, a few of you. Yeah, all of you should see it. It's one of the best documentaries. And Jodorowsky's Dune is now known as the best movie ever made. And it kind of jaded him because it never happened. And he kind of left, Hollywood with quite a bitter taste in his mouth. He ended up saying, don't make your living with cinema because Hollywood will break you. It will eat you, will destroy you. This is the reality. You have a good picture, you have success. You take the person and they destroy you. So he was kind of quite angry about the whole experience. But, the actual thing of that was so important because without that, you wouldn't have had Alien, and Mobius and Geiger went on to do all the design work for that. You wouldn't have probably had Star Wars. All of these films that came along afterwards, the massive great sci-fi blockbusters, they all owed it because a lot of the people that were working on this film then went on to make all of these other films. So he was the kind of real sort of front, visionary at the forefront of that. So he left kind of Hollywood and thought, oh, screw that, and he went off to start writing comics. And he teamed up with Mobius. This is artwork by Mobius. This is a story, the first comic that they ever did together. It was kind of more of an illustrated book, so it was text and images, but in a sequential order. And a kind of spooky, sort of disturbing sort of horror story called Eyes of a Cat. And that was in 1977. And then a couple of years later, in 1981, the two of them got together and created probably the most famous comic that he's done, called the Incal. It's interesting, talking about fools and normal wisdom. The main character in there is called John DeFool, and all of the characters and the sort of the plot is based around tarot cards. So he was bringing his knowledge of the tarot into the Incal. So the main character is this sort of lazy loser sort of detective who goes on this big spiritual quest through space. But he took a lot of the stuff, the ideas that he was going to do in Dune, he then started putting into comics because he realised he was never going to be able to make that epic film in that way. So he took one of the characters from the Incal, the Meta Baron, and created this vast saga which covers sort of several hundred years of this clan, the Meta Baron clan, and followed this main character and all of his ancestors. So you've got all these kind of great epic themes that were in Dune he put into the Meta Barons. He then did a couple of films that didn't really have the same sort of cult following. He did a film called Tusk in 1980 and The Rainbow Thief in 1990. The Rainbow Thief was again his attempt to try to engage in Hollywood, get proper sort of backing, but he didn't write the screenplay and he was feeling very trapped about doing that. And it didn't do well because he was battling with the producers. So he carried on doing the comic side of things, and he kind of started developing this thing that's become known as the Jodorowsky, which is characters from like the Meta Barons, the Techno Priests, and the Incal became a trilogy. So you've got before the Incal, final Incal, and but doing lots and lots of other stories. The Mad Woman of the Sacred Heart is it's sort of like I guess it's magic realism. It's like Paulo Coelho on crack, really. That's the best way to describe it. And then spiritual stuff like the White Llama. So he's written a vast amount of comics work as well. Let me just go back. If you try to work out what his themes are, he's always said that his films are like clouds. You know, the meaning is always changing. It's constantly changing. So he says that you can't really pin down what his films are about. But I've noticed there are a couple of themes that do crop up in his work, both in films and in his comics work. And one of them is patricide. With the Meta Barons, this is a page from the Meta Barons by Juan Jimenez. And in order to become the next Meta Baron, you have to kill your father in order to sort of progress and take on the mantle. And that's the only way forward. It's always a son that takes over, so it's a very male-centric thing. But there's definitely something about his relationship with his father. If you look at Santa Sangre, the main character's relationship with his father is a very troubled one as well. So he was kind of working through a lot of this stuff. The other sort of theme that crops up a lot in his work is limb loss. So amputees, this kind of thing crops up quite a lot. So this is his Western bouncer with the one-armed gunslinger. And then we've got, I can never pronounce this correctly, it's the Aleph Tau, which is a fantasy story. And as the story goes on, the character just keeps losing various bits of his body as he's going on. So he's down there to, lost two arms and a leg and an eye. And he carries on. Eventually, he becomes like a complete quadriplegic. So, so there are these things that kind of crop up again and again. And again in Santa Sangre, you have this is his son Axel and Blanca Guerra, and this was made in 1989, and the characters in there, as a young boy, he sees his mother's arms cut off by his father. And so he becomes like his mother's hands, and she starts controlling his arms, and he becomes almost like a slave to her, just kind of, doing everything that the hands have, and wreaks terrible revenge on people. But he said that actually Santa Sangre is his favourite film. He says, because El Topo and Holy Mountain are made with my head, and Santa Sangre are made with my feelings, with my heart. It's an emotional picture, and are much more real for me, that picture. So, and if you actually know about his childhood and everything, you can see lots of imagery and sort of elements of his childhood are in that film. The other thing that crops up quite a lot is religious imagery. So this is sort of thousands of sort of paper mache Jesus Christ from Holy Mountain. And this kind of imagery also cropped up in Son of the Gun. where you have the main character who eventually looks for sort of redemption by sacrificing himself in a Jesus-like way to a village to help bring the rains down. So, there are certain themes that do kind of crop up again and again. But, a lot of this looks brutal and violent and grisly. But actually, he's kind of been calming down a little bit in his old age. He started doing a series of films based on his childhood. And actually, I often think, that sounds a bit self-indulgent, but he's one of the few directors, I think, who's generally had such an interesting life that he could legitimately make a really fascinating film about his own life. So he did Dance of Reality back in 2013, and then followed that up this year with Endless Poetry, which both of them deal with him growing up in Chile and discovering the different art movements and evolving into the worlds of poetry. That won an award in Cannes this year, and also Variety called it, it was completely positive, saying it was the most accessible movie he's ever made, and it may also be his best. Now, the title for this talk, Kill Superheroes, Tell Your Dreams, is a direct quote from him. Despite working in comics, he's not a big superhero fan. This was actually taken by me at the British Library. He came over in 2014 and did a talk there. But one of my favourite quotes that he was talking about superheroes, he's never been one to pull his punches. He said, "Superman makes me vomit, and Batman and all that. Just all that empire, this religion. It is so important that superheroes suffer. I don't give a damn. I shit on the United States." So, he doesn't hold back, so, which I love that. So, I was lucky enough to meet him then, and he's a very, very lovely man. And he has a really fascinating sort of following of famous people that kind of just love his work. Jonathan Ross is a big fan. Nicholas Winding Refn, the director of The Neon Demon and Drive, has said that Jodorowsky is a big influence on him. And even sort of unusual people like Marilyn Manson is a big fan. He tells a very funny story that the phone rang at 3 in.the, and he picks up the phone and goes, "Hello?" And it's like, it's Marilyn Manson, is it? "Yes, what do you want?" And he actually ended up presiding over Marilyn Manson and Dita Von Teese's wedding in Ireland in 2005 as a kind of sort of priest figure for them. And then there's other people like that chap, Kanye West, is a huge fan of Jodorowsky, and has called him, Jodorowsky is one of the most inspiring artists of our time, which means I've got 1 degree of separation from Kanye West. I'm not sure how that makes me feel. There's an interesting thing. I actually work for his main publisher, which is Humanoids. And this is the latest books we've just done of him. Again, there's that theme of amputation. This main character has both his arms amputated and these giant mechanical arms put on there. So that theme constantly comes through, even to today in his work. But these 2 books, the next one's going to be coming out in March. Now, in all of our books, we've always had his name as Alexandro, as a slight variation to separate from his film work and things like this. But he's recently we decided to go back to the proper spelling. So everything now is going to be Alejandro rather than the Alexandro. Now, obviously, I don't have time to talk about all the graphic novels he's done. He's done at least about 26 for us at Humanoids. He's done 5 other graphic novels that I know of, 15 prose books, poetry, self-help, his psychomagic, which is an area of psychoanalysis that he's come up with. He's a tarot expert. He's done live giant tarot readings in Paris and Japan. Does some fantastic stuff. He's done 10 films if you include Dune, which kind of almost got made. And he turns 88 in February. And he's still going on. He's still planning new movies, still creating, still doing stuff. In fact, I think he's probably more prolific now than he has been in the last 20 or 30 years. So just to tie in with the dreams element at the beginning, I'll leave you with this final quote from him, which is, "Have a dream, fight to do a dream. Don't ask if it is possible to do something or if it is not possible. Try to do it." There you go, thank you.